She sat in the meeting and said nothing. Around her, 12 people were laughing at something the manager had just said, a joke about the budget. Everyone thought it was funny. She smiled because that was the correct response. But underneath the smile, something was happening that nobody in that room could see. Her nervous system was running a silent analysis on every person at that table. The way the manager's laugh came half a second too late. The way the colleague across from her was nodding enthusiastically while his eyes stayed completely flat. The way the newest hire was performing confidence over what was clearly terror. Nobody else noticed any of this. They were having a meeting. She was processing an entirely different layer of reality that existed underneath the meeting. And she had been doing this her entire life without knowing it had a name.
What I am about to tell you is going to permanently change how you understand yourself. Not in a self-help way, in a neurological, behavioral, scientifically documented way. If you are the kind of person who has ever felt like you were receiving a signal that everyone around you was missing, if you have ever been described as too sensitive, too intense, too perceptive for your own good, then you are not watching the wrong video. You are watching the only video that will tell you the complete truth about what you actually are. And what you actually are is not a problem. It is a very specific, very rare, extraordinarily powerful cognitive profile. One that most of the world has spent decades trying to convince you to turn off. Here is the first thing you need to understand. Human nervous systems are not all running the same software. Most people, the majority, have a nervous system optimized for efficiency. It filters out approximately 80 to 90% of the emotional and sensory information in a given environment so the person can focus and function. This filtering system is not a flaw. For most contexts, it is exactly what you need. But some nervous systems, roughly 15 to 20% of the population, based on research by psychologist Elaine Aron, do not filter the same way. They process incoming emotional, sensory, and social data at a significantly deeper level. More connections are made, more patterns are recognized, more emotional undercurrents are registered. Not because something went wrong in development, because something went differently. The deeper processing nervous system is a genuine biological variant. It is heritable, it is cross-cultural, and it has been found in over 100 other species, including horses, dogs, and fruit flies. Which tells you something important. Evolution kept it. Which means it served a function. Which means it is not an accident. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because having a nervous system built for deep processing in a world optimized for efficient processing creates a very specific kind of suffering. You are essentially running high-resolution software on a world designed for standard definition. You see things others miss. You feel things others don't register. You pick up on emotional information that never makes it into language. And for most of your life, instead of being told your system is calibrated differently, you were told some version of your system is broken. Stop overthinking. Stop overreacting. Stop taking everything so personally. And the most damaging part is not that people said those things. The most damaging part is that you believed them. You spent years, maybe decades, treating the most sophisticated perceptual system you possess as a malfunction to be managed rather than a capacity to be developed. Let me show you what I mean with something concrete. Think about a moment in your life when you sensed something was wrong with a person before they told you anything was wrong. Maybe a friend who seemed fine on the surface, but you could feel the heaviness underneath. Maybe a partner whose words were perfectly normal, but whose energy communicated something completely different. Maybe a colleague who was smiling, but whose smile was performing something rather than expressing something. You noticed, you registered it. And then, what did you do? Most likely you talked yourself out of it. You told yourself you were imagining things, projecting, being paranoid. Because that is what you have been trained to do. Dismiss the data. Now here's the question that should genuinely disturb you. How many times were you right? Not occasionally, not sometimes. Think about your track record honestly. Think about every time you felt something was off and ignored it, and then later discovered you were completely accurate. Think about every relationship that eventually revealed exactly what your nervous system told you at the beginning. Think about every situation where you overrode your perception to seem reasonable and paid for it months or years later. Your detection rate is not random. It is not coincidence. It is a nervous system doing exactly what it was built to do,
and you have been systematically disabling it your entire life. Now I want to introduce you to a concept that most psychology content never touches, because it requires understanding something about how the nervous system actually learns. Your perceptual system does not only process what is happening right now, it processes what is happening right now against everything that has happened before. Every experience you have ever had, particularly the emotionally significant ones, is stored not just as memory, but as pattern recognition data. When you experience betrayal, your nervous system does not just file it as, "that was painful." It extracts the signature. The specific behavioral patterns, vocal shifts, micro-expressions, and emotional undercurrents that preceded the betrayal. And from that point forward, when those patterns appear in a new person or situation, your system flags them. Not as a thought, as a feeling, a tightness, a wrongness, a sensation that something does not add up. This is why highly perceptive people who have been through difficult relational experiences often develop what looks like hypervigilance. The clinical framing treats this as a symptom of trauma, and in some contexts it absolutely is. But there is another layer that the clinical framing often misses. The pattern recognition itself is accurate. The nervous system is not malfunctioning. It is performing an extraordinarily sophisticated analysis. The problem is not the detection. The problem is the context. When you are surrounded by people and environments that consistently produce threat signals, your system runs constantly at high alert because the input data genuinely warrants it. That is not anxiety. That is an appropriate response to a threat-dense environment. And the solution is not to dull the system. The solution is to change the environment and to start using the system intentionally rather than having it run you from the background. There is a distinction here that I want to make very carefully because it changes everything about how you understand your own emotional experience. There is a difference between reactive perception and active perception. Reactive perception is what most highly sensitive people have been doing their entire lives without realizing it. The environment produces stimuli. The nervous system processes all of it. The person experiences the result as an overwhelming flood of emotion with no context and no control. They are constantly receiving signals they did not ask for, cannot turn off, and do not know what to do with. This is exhausting. This is what most people are describing when they say being highly sensitive feels like a curse. Active perception is something different. It is the deliberate, chosen application of your perceptual capacity in specific contexts for specific purposes. Instead of the data flooding you, you direct your attention toward the data. Instead of being overwhelmed by everyone's emotional state in a room, you choose to focus your perception on one person or one dynamic and read it with precision. Instead of your nervous system running an unfiltered analysis of every signal in your environment simultaneously, you learn to narrow the aperture, to use your perceptual system the way a high-powered lens is used. Not pointed at everything, pointed at the one thing you need to understand right now. This shift from reactive to active is not a personality change. It is a skill, and it is learnable. But it requires first understanding something that most people in this community never get taught. Your sensitivity is not the problem to solve. The relationship between your sensitivity and your attention is the problem to solve. Let me give you a practical example of what this looks like in real life. Before this shift, when you walk into a social situation that feels tense, your system floods. You immediately begin absorbing the emotional atmosphere of the entire room. Other people's anxiety becomes your anxiety. Other people's conflict becomes your conflict. You spend the next 4 hours either managing your overwhelm or managing everyone else's emotions, and you leave completely depleted. After this shift, the same room, the same signals. But instead of being absorbed by the data, you observe it. You register the tension, you note it, you ask internally, what specifically is the source? You identify the two people in the room who are carrying the most unresolved charge, and you make a simple decision. You either engage with that directly if it is relevant to you, or you consciously choose not to absorb it because it is not yours to carry. You leave the room with your own energy intact. This sounds small. It is not small. This is the difference between living in a body that functions as an antenna, picking up every signal indiscriminately, and living in a body that functions as a precision instrument, gathering exactly the data you need and filtering out the rest. And the capacity for that precision was built into your system from the beginning. What was missing was the instruction to use it deliberately. Now, I want to address something that comes up for almost everyone at this point in the conversation. Because I have been making this sound like a straightforward cognitive reframe, understand your sensitivity differently and everything improves. And while that understanding is genuinely foundational, there is a harder truth underneath it that matters just as much. The reason most highly sensitive people struggle is not only because they misunderstand their own nature, it is because they have been operating in environments specifically unsuited to their cognitive profile, and in many cases have been unconsciously attracted to the most draining environments possible. Here is why that happens. A nervous system built for deep processing is also a nervous system that runs at a higher baseline level of stimulation seeking. This is counterintuitive because most sensitive people describe themselves as seeking quiet and calm. And they do, consciously. But at a deeper level, the nervous system is drawn toward complexity, toward emotional density, toward situations and people that generate a lot of internal data to process. Which means, without awareness, sensitive people often gravitate toward emotionally complex, chaotic, or even manipulative relationships, not because they are broken, but because those environments are stimulating to a system built to process stimulation. The problem is that stimulation and nourishment are not the same thing. A nervous system can be highly activated by an environment that is simultaneously destroying it. High stimulation does not mean healthy engagement. It means high stimulation. This is one of the most overlooked dynamics in the psychology of sensitive people. The people who drain you the most are often the people your nervous system finds most interesting. Not interesting in the way a healthy connection is interesting, where complexity reveals depth and generates genuine understanding. Interesting in the way a puzzle is interesting, where inconsistency generates constant processing activity because your system keeps trying to resolve the contradiction. Manipulative people, emotionally unavailable people, chaotic people, they create an endless stream of unresolved signals. For a nervous system built to detect and analyze signals, that is an extremely activating experience. It can feel like intensity, chemistry, depth, and it can keep a deeply perceptive person locked in a relationship or environment for years past the point where they consciously know it is damaging them. Once you see this mechanism, you cannot unsee it. Because suddenly the question is no longer, why do I keep ending up in these situations? The question becomes, what does my nervous system need to be genuinely nourished rather than just highly activated? And those are very different environments. Nourishing environments for a deeply perceptive nervous system share some consistent characteristics. They involve people who are emotionally honest, which means less contradiction to resolve, which paradoxically feels less immediately intense, but generates significantly more genuine connection over time. They involve a pace of interaction that allows depth, rather than demanding constant performance. They involve situations where your perception is an asset, rather than an inconvenience. Where the people around you are capable of receiving the level of awareness you operate at without being destabilized by it. Many sensitive people have never been in an environment like that. They have spent their entire lives either overstimulated and depleted, or numbed out and searching for something real. The idea that an environment can be both deeply engaging and genuinely nourishing at the same time is, for some of them, genuinely unfamiliar. Now I want to bring you back to the woman in the meeting, because her story does not end with the meeting. A few months after that day, she had a conversation with the manager, the one whose laugh came half a second too late. She had been watching him for weeks by this point, noting patterns, not obsessing, not ruminating, but consciously directing her perception towards something specific because she had decided to trust her data rather than dismiss it. She identified something, a discrepancy between what he said about a project in team meetings and what he said about the same project in one-on-one conversations. Small, easy to rationalize away. She did not rationalize it away. She documented it, and she raised it with the right person at the right time. 3 weeks later, an investigation confirmed exactly what she had detected in that first meeting. Not because she had proof in the traditional sense, because she had paid attention to a signal that everyone else in the room had filtered out. That is not a superpower in the mystical sense. That is pattern recognition operating at its full capacity, deployed deliberately, with restraint, at precisely the right moment. That is a highly perceptive nervous system functioning the way it was built to function. And the only thing that changed between years of overwhelm and that moment of precision was one thing. She stopped apologizing for what she noticed and started trusting it. That is the shift. Not a personality transformation, not a years-long healing journey, a decision. The decision to treat your perception as data rather than dysfunction. To treat your emotional responses as information rather than weakness. To stop asking, what is wrong with me for feeling this, and start asking, what is this feeling trying to tell me, and what do I do with that information? And once that question replaces the old one, everything reorganizes. Not all at once, not painlessly, but irreversibly. Because you cannot go back to dismissing something you have learned to trust. You cannot unfeel the accuracy of a system you have finally given permission to function. The anxiety does not disappear overnight, but it begins to change shape. It stops being a flood with no source and starts being a signal with a direction. And a signal with a direction is something you can work with. Here's the final thing I want to leave you with, and it is something almost no one in this space says directly enough. The world does not suffer from a shortage of people who can perform and produce and optimize. It has plenty of those. What it genuinely lacks are people who can feel what is actually happening underneath the surface. Who can sense when a group is heading toward a rupture before the rupture occurs. Who can identify when someone is suffering beneath a composed exterior before that suffering becomes a crisis. Who can detect dishonesty, inconsistency, and misalignment early enough to address it rather than survive it. Those capacities are not soft. They are not secondary. In any domain where human dynamics matter, which is every domain, they are among the most consequential capabilities that exist. You were built with those capabilities. You have been developing them your entire life, often against conditions that were actively hostile to their development. The question is not whether you have them. The question is whether you are finally going to use them on purpose. Everything you have felt, every relationship that hurt you, every room that overwhelmed you, every moment you knew something before you could explain how you knew it. None of that was wasted. It was all calibration for something that is still ahead of you. The only thing left to decide is whether you are going to keep calling it a problem, or whether you are finally ready to call it what it actually is, the most sophisticated thing about you.